Before we start this show, just a word from our sponsor, 20 by 20 Apparel. Founded in 2015, 20 by 20 Apparel brings original tributes to pro wrestling's classic arenas, moments, and events. They look to spotlight the bloopers, bleeps, and body slams along with the biggest, smallest, strangest, and strongest that pro wrestling has had to offer. Along with their awesome line of pro wrestling apparel, they do offer many services. In the world of wrestling, there are hundreds of shirts, promotions, flyers, social media accounts, and ads. Don't get lost in the sea of parody shirts and display fonts. They can provide professional graphic design services at a reasonable price. 20 by 20 also hand screen prints all the tees in-house. If you would like to discuss possible run of tees, posters, koozies, foam fingers, or whatever, drop them a line. Go to 20 by 20 Apparel. That's the number 20x, the number 20 apparel.com. Now, let's get to the show.
Fresh is the word.
I'm Jim Duggan, got long wood for plenty hoes. I keep it fresher than fresh, but you already know. You suckers bummy, I'm money, I got a ton of flows. My weed loud like a motherfucking thunder roll. Your shit quiet like you ballin' on a budget though. We see your kicks and we laugh and yellin' what are those. You see me shining like a suit on puffy. You know my grindin' shit is too strong, buddy. That's why the dude call money. I be stuntin' like it's nothing at all. Cause it's nothing to me, it's probably something to y'all. Trying to smoke like me, then come and fuck with your dog. Got a closet full of kicks, you can't cop at the mall. And I'm fresher than the freshest, you can tell it's in my essence. Bitch, you see the way I'm rapping, yes I do this shit to death. I tell I'm running out of breath, I tell somebody cut a check. But either way you know it's fresh, and either way you know it's fresh. Fresh, we fresh. Fresh, goddammit, we fresh.
Welcome to the Fresh is the Word podcast. I'm your host, Kelly K. Fresh Frazier. And on Fresh is the Word, we like to deliver wisdom through great stories from the minds of bright creatives of pop culture. Through those stories, we like to dissect the journey of our guests and present actionable lessons and advice for our listeners, no matter what career or avenue of artistry they pursue. And before we get into this episode, I want to give a shout out to Knox Money, Bang Belushi, and Foulmouth for the theme music for Fresh is the Word. And if you would like to support the podcast, you can always go to freshisthepodcast.com and just share any of the links for any of the episodes on any of your social media platforms. And also, you can subscribe to Fresh is the Word pretty much anywhere that podcasts are streamed. And that includes Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, pretty much everywhere. And please rate and review, especially on Apple Podcasts. It will definitely help out the show. If you want to contact me, you can always reach me by email at djkfresh@gmail.com. Or you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at KFresh is the Word, and on Facebook at facebook.com/KFresh. And you can also follow Fresh is the Word on Twitter at Fresh is the Word, and that's is with an IZ, Instagram at Fresh is the Word Podcast, and Facebook at facebook.com/Fresh is the Podcast. And this is episode 152, and the guest for this episode is South African MC Yugen Blakrok, who released their sophomore album, Anima Mysterium, earlier this year that featured Cool Keith, Brave Star, Historian himself, Fifi the Rye Master, and with production from Kanif the Jot Master for the entire album, their chemistry is unparalleled with a sound that takes a nod to the old school trip hop sound. During our chat, in which Kanif was also present, we talked about her musical influences, her visuals, the shadow universes she's creating, the South African music scenes, their artistic freedoms, the South African society and culture, how their upbringing influenced their art, the truth of South African history, the spirituality of the South African people, and social hierarchies. Before we get into this interview with Yugen, I definitely want to remind you how you can support the podcast. I do have a Patreon page set up at patreon.com/Fresh is the Word. And for as little as $1, you can support everything that I do. And for the $3 a month amount, you will have access to the Patreon-only podcast, which will include interviews from my vast archive of interviews outside of the podcast. Mostly, it's pretty much all music from the past 10 years. I've got a couple already up. Danny Brown from 2008, Cool Keith from 2010, and I have a slew of other great interviews to follow. So go to patreon.com/freshastheword and you can sign up. There's a bunch of different tiers available. Some you can be a part of the show. All right, let's get on to the interview with Yugen Blakrok and Kanif. Came about you and your music a few months ago when I got a press release from your publicist, and I was like, when I started listening to it, I was like, I love this. This is great. This like really reminds me of a lot of the hip hop I grew up on, but then it also mixes a lot of sort of that down tempo, like trip hop also that I really liked back in the day too. And sort of what has always been your influence musically throughout the years when you were younger, first starting to make music, even up till today?
There's been quite a range, I think, growing up from like local sounds in South Africa to, like you've mentioned, like the trip hop was also pretty much influential in terms of making music, the kind of music that I like to hear. So this is what influenced me, I think, the most, the stuff that comes out. And if I can say also, Kanif also kind of shares similar tastes, I think, in music. With growing up, hip hop is also very prominent, I think, in our upbringing.
I think I liked a lot of the dark, the Wu-Tang and Grave Diggers and Beastie Boys, a bit of the rock influence, Public Enemy, and that's the kind of sound. And when I heard trip hop, how they kind of slowed down the frequency and stuff, obviously that appealed to me quite a bit. And in terms of the rhyming too, because the beats are slower, there's more space to rhyme on it, and that whole style I think was an influence. I think another influence though would be West African, Malian music, Ali Fakatoure, and I think that influences our sound quite a bit, just in its bluesiness,
Yeah, for sure. Like really, the dark rhythms is what we sort of gravitate to in these different genres that you'll find.
Yeah, that's what I really love about your music is like the dark rhythms, and also what I notice is that in the videos that you put out for the selected songs that you did, the sort of the visuals kind of match that those dark rhythms. What did you want to do with your music videos to sort of enhance the songs?
Well, ideally, the idea is to build a shadow world. Talk about the Anima, Mysterium, and all the concepts that I discuss in there, to the sounds that I use from Kanif's section. And also visually, we needed something to accompany that, something like a listening aid, to kind of expand
the universe.
Yeah, the universe that we're occupying and the universe that we're trying to share with everyone. So they had to be fitting to that aesthetic, explore that dimension. I mean, we see everyday things, and we kind of didn't want to go that route where you're sort of spoon feeding people, So it's more to leave these certain symbols or archetypal kind of puzzles for people to solve, for the right people to solve, if anything.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think we wanted to leave space for the audience to interpret some stuff, and we also wanted to have a bit more fun than with the first album, just presenting
an audio,
the world and the universe that the music is from.
Yeah, the idea of like creating universes, that's something that you see in all sorts of different art forms, whether it is music or even comic books or even fine art or whatever. Like, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to create when you are creating these these shadow universes. What do you hope like your listeners, and even for the videos, the people who are watching the videos, hope they get out of this shadow universe?
Well, I think firstly, it's a real tangible part of life. I think we come from in South Africa, the unseen and the seen are slightly more side by side than in more Western cultures, and it's old and it's new. It's some of the information visually and musically is old information that kind of sits in the future somehow. So a lot of people are saying it's Afrofuturistic kind of visual, and I think for us it's just it's the universe that we inhabit naturally. It's
not so much universes we create, but just exposing what's there, like the layers that are there, the hidden worlds.
What do you okay, you're from South Africa. No one South Africa is a place where maybe not too many people really understand what goes on there. What is the music scene like there?
It's quite mixed, and you have a pretty big gap between what is considered mainstream and the alternative scene. So there's a lot of African art in general can be quite spiritual. In a way, there's a lot of history and ancient teachings and knowledge that hide behind the artworks. With South Africa, it's not that different. We do have different sources that we all draw from in terms of inspiration, and that manifests in all the different genres, whether it's jazz or kwaito or the new hip hop or R&B and all of that sort. I do think that it's quite lively in terms of the independent scene. They're free thinkers, really, going against the grain type of folks, because the system doesn't really work for independent artists, So it kind of forces a more DIY type of approach, a more gutsy approach, because the thought that you're going to be the next big thing is not as tangible. It's quite far. So I do think that the art tends to push the boundaries, because that kind of mainstream success seems so far, so out of reach. So I do find like a lot of gutsy, raw, whether you're looking at the rock scene or even the hip hop scene itself, it's quite grimy. It's very nice.
Right. That's what I get out of your music. That griminess, that DIY sort of aesthetic, that freedom to be able to do what you want to do. How does it feel to going into making art, knowing that, hey, mainstream success probably isn't going to happen, so I'm just going to do my art the way I want to do it? What sort of freedom does that bring to you artistically?
Oh, it's great artistically. Financially, it's not maybe where you want to be, but like, if that's the one thing that empowers me, that I make art, that's the most important thing then, So to make it to the best of my ability, and once you do get some kind of recognition or attention for it, it does push you a bit further. It does give you that extra jolt to search in places where you normally wouldn't, to set up your own platform and things. But it's great, man. It's empowering in some ways. It can be very exhausting to have to be responsible for every single thing that you do, Right. So it has pros and cons, but I think it teaches you a whole lot more than the alternative with it, which is to just look for a major to take care of my everything and do it, and all I have to do is just pitch up on the stage, In that regard, I don't feel like the art grows. The thing about coming from South Africa also, I have enough angst, man, for like a good 3 more decades. The conditions do make for really good art, but sometimes it's like at the expense of one's spirit, The conditions can be quite hard. It's much tougher, I think, than out here in Europe. for example, for an independent artist to be self-sufficient, not necessarily like super successful, but just self-sufficient to be able to sustain oneself. So I don't know, I feel like it gives us an edge out here coming from South Africa. You know, we're much more hungry than our counterparts. You know, a lot of stuff that we encounter here look like luxuries to us compared to what we have to fight for to get at home. So there is that, like, there's different ways you can look at it. We just prefer to look at the more proactive one, which is we're pretty much geared up for Europe, I think.
It's definitely inspiring. Every musician wants, the most people
listening to their stuff,
their music,
observing.
So to have a wider audience somehow gives us a bigger platform to play on, and with the visuals and the videos
and like-minded people, or even people that will challenge our own way of thinking, is great for the next project or the next.
Yeah. And definitely the last kind of 3-4 years of touring Europe and making the Anima Mysterium, we were affected by being out in Europe and seeing some of our heroes perform, and it changed, because South Africa is kind of a bit far and isolated, and I think it's also nice because you kind of get lost in your own creative world and you can really do your own thing, but
you're also excluded from a lot of things that are happening culturally, whether we're talking about the global hip-hop scene, for example.
Right.
You don't get many opportunities to watch like super established artists coming through. Maybe it'll be like post-golden era hip-hop artists that will make it down there eventually when they're 50 or something.
Right.
Which is great, for us that grew up listening to that stuff.
A couple of years back, we saw Pete Rock and CL Smooth. We opened for them in Copenhagen, and like in a basement type setup with just this. And for me, it was one of the first hip hop shows I'd ever been to. But despite having seen quite a few acts, just the feeling of it and the intimacy of it, and so those kind of moments have definitely inspired us
and shape our stuff. Continue to shape how we do our art, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned about the sort of obstacles you have to deal with in South Africa, the conditions. How do you sort of deal with all of that and still sort of, keep your sanity, keep your mental health in check, keep your, your spirit up? How do you kind of deal with all that?
It's all trial and error. Most of the time, I'm not sure if my mental health is intact, really. I kind of go around, fixing what I can. But I mean, it does take its toll on you. You notice it in the people that are around you. If you're lucky enough to have a support system that will say, hey, maybe girl, you need to check yourself a little bit over here. It does get a bit overwhelming, but nothing comes easy, man. I think the teachings that drew us to hip hop in the first place, we're still looking at. You know what I mean? All the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the 90s, the stuff that really got us into the art form, is what we continue to push, outside of our music as well.
I think we have
breathing, having, time, and just keeping perspective.
Having been in the industry for, almost close to 2 decades, some of us at Iapetus, we've also created a bit of a safe haven for our creative spirits, and so we've got a studio there in central Joburg, and we tend to isolate ourselves a little bit and just work on our music and work on our videos and all kinds of weird stuff and stop motions and just stay making art, because
it's easy to get caught up in this external stuff. You do need that space.
And the world is in a bit of a strange place, and until it goes south, or we're just gonna carry on making art and trying to contribute positive vibes.
Even though you say that down in South Africa, there's a big gap between sort of the mainstream and the underground, does it ever happen when the mainstream sort of appropriates the underground's art and sort of the underground kind of gets left in the dust in regards to that?
Yeah, everywhere. Like 10, 15 years ago, even, the concept of rapping about space and intergalactic stuff and chakras and all of that in South Africa was kind of, oh, you guys are, high art and super conceptual. This is not real. But because Hollywood has been stuffing it down our throats for the last 10 years as well, it's made it very mainstream. You know what I mean? Like you'll see Katy Perry talking about E.T., hanging outside this shuttle trying to kiss this alien and stuff. It's pop culture. It's like mainstream,
Right.
So, I mean, there is that. The mainstream is also famous for that, just picking what it likes from the alternative or underground scene and just blowing that up, and then it's a fad for a while and moves on. That's just a cycle.
I see the danger being in especially in the history books, what they're writing and who they're writing about, and when they
rewrite history.
When they exclude certain people, the younger generation musicians, especially when they come up, they don't have they don't go back and have access to the right artists, and therefore some of their foundations are lacking, and so yeah, it's constant, man. I mean, the mainstream is always getting its inspiration from the underground scene, and it's been like that, I guess.
Yeah.
From more of a, outside of the music scene, from more of a societal or even political side of everything, describe how it was like growing up in South Africa, and how did that ultimately influence your art?
Do you want to talk first?
Okay, well, for me, I think, South Africa has an aesthetic. It has a feel and a taste and a color and a sound and a rhythm. And it also has, as Yugen was saying earlier, it has a rich oral history, tradition of oral history, and within the storytelling and within the music and within, the mythology. And I find that the art is kind of really inspired by those tales of continuing the story of the creation myth, so to speak.
Mm. Yeah, that was pretty much South Africa for me. Like growing up with stories all the time. We still had, growing up on a farm with cousins and aunts, and bedtime was African stories and things like this, outside of what we were learning in school. And what we're learning in school was pretty much a very Eurocentric history of South Africa, where the natives are painted as just these barbaric folks that attacked these kind white people for nothing, So there was that growing up, a lot of weird propaganda. And so what you'd see in the streets just wouldn't reflect to what you know at home. There's a sense of dignity at home. There's a sense of security and space. But outside in the streets, if there's any kind of confrontation, if it's racial, it's very jarring for any kid, to be shouted at across the street or to have stones thrown at you, and, stuff that is happening to friends, is happening to us in all these places. It did kind of create there's something strange kind of feeling, so getting into hip-hop was kind of a way to confront that, because there were similarities in what these folks were talking about. And even though I was maybe too young to completely grasp what Capadonna and Reza and all of these cats were talking about, there was an urgency and a sense of like a oppressed rage that I felt close to, or that I had an affinity for. And that was just hip-hop in general at that time.
I think the reason that 90s hip-hop found such a strong audience in South Africa was definitely the militancy of the sound.
Yeah, for real.
And that's why that kind of sound, and you had crews like POC out of Cape Town that were fairly militant and Black Noise and quite conscious crews. Mm-hmm. And it definitely resonated there, and it rooted a sound that you can still find in you know, in our music now.
Yeah, 100%.
Outside of South Africa, usually what people know about South Africa is that sort of Eurocentric view of it, or they know of apartheid, stuff like that, you know. But you
Yeah.
you know, mentioned history a lot, even in this interview, that it influences you. From your perspective, what is the true look of South Africa? You know, what is the true history of South Africa? You know, what are the things that stick out to you? You know, what is the myths that people have of South Africa?
Wow. It's a lot, actually. I mean, also it can come across as very opposing views. Like maybe some folks are pretty much sold on the Rainbow Nation, what is it, rhetoric, or that story or that narrative that everybody's super happy and united and not racist. You know, that was the promise that we sort of got when we had the first democratic elections, and that was like 20 something years ago in 1994, you know. So that's kind of like an ideal, but it's not really there. It's racially tense, you know, in an odd kind of way, because apartheid was like a psychological social experiment, and although it was formally gotten rid of in 1994, you can still see the effects of it 20 years later, from the generation that was directly affected to the generation after that, who didn't have to experience it physically but could, you know, the unseen effects. We're still suffering under the unseen effects. That's us, you know. And the generation that comes after us, that are kind of, you know, we're not aware of this race thing. So it's really quite layered, and it's layered, man. It's complex. And
in terms of some of the mythology and the history you're referring to, I would say it's just found in South African culture. For example, Credo Mutwa and there are various teachers and historians who custodians of oral histories and stories of different people, and when they journeyed into South Africa sometimes, and often, you know, it's quite sci-fi, the information, and it's it's ancient alternatives to some of the famous creation myths. So, but that information is because, as Yugen said, there's been this apartheid oppression. The information kind of went underground and became a bit more secretive and a bit more, you had to search and dig for it. But as I said earlier, you know, the seen and the unseen are quite connected amongst Southern African people in general. And by that I mean consulting your ancestors and you know, just your ancestors' hand in your day-to-day life is quite important and respected, and so, you know, it's a cross of the seen and the unseen, and these deep political you know, fights and a deeply spiritual people.
mm,
There's a thing called in South Africa called Ubuntu, which is, you know, almost like Taoism, which is, it's kind of an unspoken, undefined energy, but which is one of giving, what I have, and, you know, unity, and so I think it's very magical, and it's very political and tense, and it's very beautiful, and yeah, and that's why it's a great place to make music and write these stories out, you know.
How would you describe the spiritualism of the people of South Africa, and how does that compare to the sort of, you know, religious factions of South Africa?
spirituality and religion. I mean, in terms of religion, there's Christianity, And, there's Islam, there's Judaism. South Africa is pretty mixed in terms of its people. Amongst all the different tribes with their own different beliefs, there's also been a welcoming of like a Chinese community, an Indian community, and other African communities, whether it's Uganda or Congo, Zimbabwe, Angola. So it's really, really pretty mixed in itself. So that's what also makes it special. It isn't just like like a typical one language speaking, one faith sharing people. It's many different faiths, and with the constitution and all of this allowing people to kind of stay together in the same spot, and the idea that everyone is free to practice whatever religion or spiritual belief that they want. It's all well and good on paper, but also in practice there is a tolerance, I feel, that you wouldn't really see anywhere else. Like our Muslim community is pretty strong and respected, and living side by side to Christian, Jewish, to different African traditional beliefs as well. So that I do find to be uniquely South African also. You can attribute it to a whole lot of horrible things that have happened, and maybe people just want to do better. But I think it's just the people are special like this. So there's a big tolerance. So there are many different faiths.
South Africans have got a really great sense of humor.
Yeah.
And I think it's helped them through some really difficult times, and it's given them a very almost Zen-like tolerance to a lot
because
of
Ubuntu, umntu ngumntu ngabantu, literally, I am because you are. If that was very short, and I am because you are. The recognition of the other is very important. So among South African natives, that idea is humanity itself. I can't live across from you and be living in opulence and you're starving to death. That is very un-African. And so with, capitalism and all of this other stuff it's kind of distorted that kind of harmony in there. Everyone is rushing to make it. Everything is expensive. Everyone is moving to the cities and all of this stuff. And it is disrupting an already fragile psychology, So, religion itself right now, I think, is under fire. Folks are kind of rediscovering themselves from an African point of view, not from a Eurocentric one where, Christianity was the be-all and end-all. Now I think folks are kind of questioning their own lineage, their own histories, their own ancestors and what the belief system was, and not only that, but to revere it as much as they revered all these other religions that have passed through.
Yeah, and definitely more and more, I think, a rejection of the
Western,
what is seen as the missionary brought religions, and a return to a respect of the traditional ways. Yeah.
What sort of obstacles do you see? What sort of challenges do you see that people are having when they're reassessing who they are, to reassessing their place in Africa in that way, that they have in comparison to sort of the status quo of whether it's the government or society? What sort of challenges do you see happening?
Off the top of my head, an African Renaissance would mean reevaluating, let's say, beauty standards, something very, very personal, and also something that's pretty much $1 billion industry as well. An industry made for people to feel a certain way about their physical selves. The idea of what it is to be considered desirable. For women, for example, or the concept of what a man is within a cultural, stance, as well as being a person at work. You know what I mean? If you're going to work and the upper management is all white, and everyone else that you're working with, or shit that's been divided according to class and color. These are the conditions under which people are trying to discover themselves. So even if you can say, oh, we have this beautiful history behind us, the present moment is kind of showing you that there's still that inequality at work. You know what I'm saying? So you can change your mind about how you feel and all of this, but you're still waking up in the morning and you're going to work for these corporates. So the other things are maybe, entrepreneurship and the encouragement of that, and black business and pro-black thinking that is not anti-white,
Yeah.
Things that communities need to fix. You know what I'm saying? And at the moment, the black community at large, and also in general, I'm just grouping black people together, is kind of in that space where they're fixing and looking at themselves. And in South Africa, we kind of need the white community to do that as well, to reflect and evaluate their treatment of others and how they view themselves as well before good communication can happen. Because even right now, when I say things are racially tense, it's like observing a situation but still feeling somehow tied up when it's time to speak up, because you're talking to people that are so defensive that it's not easy to have these conversations or to get the point across.
I think on an individual level, South Africa feels highly advanced racially. I find them to be some of the least racially conscious, but that's on a one-to-one level amongst some artists and musicians and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I think the dialogue between general, populace is one that needs to happen. For example, something that would lead, I think, to a lot more economic freedom and that thus equality is the land situation and how the Western media has kind of portrayed it, and how the right wing Afrikaans organizations are trying to portray it as like this land grab, which is not really the case, and I mean, there are terrible loss of life amongst the farmers, but it's not actually a higher rate than amongst any other population.
The people that they're killing.
So that those dialogues really need to happen, and I think that with it, a lot of youth that I know that I just talk with, they want land, and it's not always just to start a farm. It could be to build a studio, or to build to make a film set, or to
just live, to be able to do their culture, to have their cultural practices in peace. You can't be doing your cultural practices while you're renting your spot from some. It's not your land. There is a deep connection between Africans and the land that they live on. It's completely ridiculous to feel homeless in your own home country forever, just generations deep. You cannot have this. It's ridiculous.
So yeah, I think so. Those are definitely some of the things that will, because apartheid is young. It's we're still studying the effects of it. We're not saying okay, it's done with and that was in the past. We have the first generation and second generation and third generation on both sides of people who have to deal with those those psychological oppressions, and it's complicated and it's
In South Africa, is there a sort of a hierarchy in regards to the populace, whether it's by race, class, gender, whatever, and what is that?
Yeah, there is.
I mean, it's following the worldwide trend. So it's all the above mentioned. We're all being divided really by class. I think maybe
apartheid handled the racial divisions with the white people at the top, the Indians, the Chinese, colored, and then the blacks. There was that, and it did play psychologically on everybody. So some of those attitudes are still there. We've moved past a lot of them. We can talk about it. I think that's why Kanif means that racially advanced. There are certain conversations that you can have without starting a riot. But then at the same time, there's certain conversations that we need to have, that we're stuck on, that we need to get passed on for progress. So there are those hierarchies. It's now more a class division than a money division, where it was just like before it was white people had the cash and black people didn't. Now there's a black elite.
It's still
white
highly
folks.
imbalanced, but
It's still very unbalanced. The wealth gap is pretty big still.
Again amongst populace.
Mm.
You mentioned earlier how the black population in South Africa is finding ways to sort of fix their issues in their history, and while doing that, it really needs to be to a point where also the white populace needs to start fixing their issues also, and that kind of goes into that issue of what's a good ally to these sort of progressed factions of the community. What, in your perspective, what makes a good ally towards sort of an oppressed faction of people?
Well, again, there's the Credo Mutwa, who's the Zulu custodian of the Zulus people's history and story. He got into a bit of trouble for supposedly revealing a bit too much information about that was more secretive, and that you had to go through some kind of initiations before you received. And he said that his reason was that the more we know about each other, the more we'll be forgiving and realize that we're not that different in our fundamental desires, and I tend to lean that way, and I've seen it in music and in subcultures, hip hop and skateboarding and graffiti, and a lot of subcultures where the kids are mixed up, and we grew up like that, where being white was more something that you'd get dissed about in a rap battle, but it wasn't really that much in your face, and it's because we knew each other, we knew that how similar we were. So
yeah, I have to agree with
self-knowledge, the more we know about ourselves and about each other,
the better. The best allies for an oppressed people is each other, because the war on us has been to separate us, so all that effort was made just to separate us, you know what I mean? The first thing, therefore, I think, to try and repair anything is to repair the broken connections with each other. So it really has to go back to individuals checking themselves, how they speak and what they let into their space. If anything, like social media will show you what bad communication is amongst each other. And also, like, as Kanif has highlighted, in like these different genres, whether you're looking at hip hop DJs kind of looking out for each other and playing together in a healthy competitive scene that is not malicious, because competition is part of hip hop, but not in that weird beef kind of super macho way that's pushed, but in a more natural, more human way where we can kind of see each other. I feel as though also that the gap between the artists that we look at, or even further, like celebrity culture, there's this big gap between that and the consumer, and it's almost forced. It creates so much more conflict than to see the person as they are. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're a human being doing something well does not excuse you being an asshole, and that's a fact. Everybody knows that in whatever
Exactly.
When it comes to certain things, or because these certain people are influential, we're so quick to want to give our power. This person's influencing my children this way, but where am I as a parent? These kind of thoughts need to be taken all the way through. So it's just things like that, man. Really, the connections between each other is what matters the most. We can't move as a unit if no one is listening to anything. It really, there's no conversation to be had.
And I think the artists that we encounter, and that the artists back home that we encounter out here, most of them I feel are pushing that agenda. It's quite unified in in its vision.
Mm.
And that's part of what I find really progressive about South Africa's non-racialist progression. You know, something special did come out of all that mess. You know, there was no revolution, there was no blood led into the ground, but something else did happen. That once we can heal, and once we can start knowing ourselves and having the conversations, you know, there's something really special there. I think that's part of the beauty of the place, you know.
You've mentioned a few times about, you know, specific discussions that need to be had, and sometimes it could cause an uproar. What are those discussions from a societal standpoint that need to continue to happen to make progress in South Africa?
We need integration, man. The us versus them debate has dragged on for so long, and it's just proved itself to have no end. If you want to start an us versus them debate, it will never end. This is a fact. So even that is kind of tired. Like we really do need to. It's little things, man, Kelly. Like if you know, on a racial matter, like expression or wearing your hair natural in schools shouldn't be a problem. But you find in South Africa there's certain schools that will maybe outlaw, you know, black girls from rocking afros. You know what I mean? You have to chemically treat your hair through relaxers and all of this shit in some dodgy, not really straight kind of want to be white kind. It doesn't really work. It's not great for anyone's self-esteem, and this isn't something that's normal or okay in Africa, you know, but it also creates psychological things that have to be dealt with in the future. So when you do start a conversation with someone else about appearance or about hair or about this, and they just telling you you're just pulling out the race card, or you're just imagining it, or they're refusing to see where you're coming from. This is what the issue is, you know. It's a standpoint of, oh, well, we're not responsible for these horrible situations. This is maybe our predecessors 40, 50 years ago that started this, and we're not responsible. And the black perspective is, yes, we understand that, but can you just see that you're benefiting from a system that was put in place to make you be in this position today, and for me to be in this unpleasant situation today? If both parties can't say, yeah, I see that, it creates more conflict, because you're deliberately not seeing the other human being. You are deliberately being un-African in Africa. You know what I'm saying? Then if you don't want to be there, don't be there. It's about respect. It's about culture. It's about seeing the other human being. You know what I mean? I wouldn't come to Spain and do some super disrespectful stuff to Spanish people. You know what I'm saying? I've been taught better than that. That's the African way, is to see the other human being. So things like this. So when I say the white community needs to check themselves, they need to remember that they're in Africa as much as I'm part Dutch, or you know, that kind of thing. I hate to get into it because it starts getting a bit personal, but you know, I prefer to just generalize. But I'm just making an example. You know what I mean? Right. Like being hard of hearing, or just being in denial. In general, this is like the general thing that frustrates South Africans. You know, the inability or the refusal to just hear the other person out, just because maybe the experiences are not the same.
Right. I always like to ask this question when I interview people. From your perspective, what is sort of a nugget of knowledge, you know, a lesson that you could take from your life or career that anybody listening to this, no matter what sort of avenue of artistry or background they come from, could learn from and project into their own life?
What I think, you know, is definitely one thing that served us well is just staying true to I think all musicians start out in a garage with your friends and banging around on some instruments and that fun element of making music and what appeals to you and what songs and songwriting you want to write. Just keep writing them. Don't think, okay, well, writing about this is working really well for so and so let me write about something that I'm not. I think we always just try and take a magnifying glass to what we are and stay true and make hip hop that sounds fat to us when we're in the studio with our peoples and and if you keep building your tribe, if you keep building the amount of people that resonate to that frequency, it gets bigger and stronger, and at some point it pulls in enough people that people have to recognize it.
Yeah, for sure. I think definitely staying true to yourself is one, and also like be centered. There's a lot happening at any given moment. It's easy to fall into these ruts or into these traps if you're in a creative space or running your own ship. These kinds of things is to find that center. If you find yourself completely off your feet, to take time to discover what center means for you. Because a lot of things are made out here to just shift us, into needing them. For me, it's like the world of advertising and marketing and all these products are just created for needs, just make sure you can handle your own needs and not just be pulled any which way direction. I think for any field that might be relevant.
Great. Before we end this interview, I definitely want to know something. This is something I was thinking about during the whole interview. When it comes to South African music, who are the artists from either the past or the present, whether it's hip hop or rock or soul music or whatever, who you deem like classic artists, important to the culture? Like, who are some South African music artists that people should go online and maybe look up and listen to that would have a very distinct voice for that region?
Yo, Thandiswa Mazwai, definitely. Thandiswa Mazwai is epic, from the ages that she was and still is active in, and for her vision as much as her voice, from 90s, 2000s up until now. She's special. She's really, really dope.
Obviously, Hugh Masekela.
Yeah.
There's a young artist from Lesotho, Morena Leraba, really doing some interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Pops Mohammed, he plays more kind of traditional Southern African instruments. He's a genius, really.
Yeah, that's true.
Carlo Mombelli, who's a bassist, and plays also like street signs and all kinds of weird stuff. It's really
progressive, really, really nice.
The Brother Moves On, BCUC, which are young dudes coming up and just
right now
mixing a bunch of rhythms and sounds. And
Brother Moves On.
Yeah.
Yeah, those folks, I think. That's a nice list.
There's a lot, man. Just go wild. There's a lot of interesting stuff, in the jazz community also. Philip Tabane,
Sibusile Xaba, Sibusile.
Yeah,
Sibusile Xaba.
Who are deep coming out of Mamelodi near Pretoria and it's a lot of progressive stuff and rooted in some ancient rhythms too. And It's a beautiful mix.
All right, great. It's been great talking with you. Thank you, Kanif and Yugen, for taking the time out to chat with me. It was basically a nice history lesson about South African music and society. Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of good things that you talk to me about. Thank you.
Tough introspective questions, man.
Yeah, they're really great, Kelly.
Thank you.
So before we get out of here, where can people go online to get more information about your music or whatever you're doing these days?
We're on all these social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Bandcamp, Yugen Blakrok. You'll find our stuff on Spotify, I think first and second album, and features, remixes, all of this stuff. Whatever social network they're on, just look for us there.
I'm trying to reach you, so
Yeah.
just check the line and type it in.
All right, that was my interview with Yugen Blakrok along with Kanif. It was great talking with them. Got a lot of history in regards to South Africa, a lot of great knowledge about what's going on in South Africa right now and how the music influences. Links, videos, and audio for Yugen Blakrok and how to purchase her album are in the show notes for this episode at freshasthepodcast.com. All right, another interview in the bag. Thank you for listening. Goodbye and good night.
Fresh is the word.